Hello, everyone. I am with Melanie Starr Costello, PhD, and she is a licensed psychologist, historian, and Jungian Analyst in private practice in Washington, D.C. She earned a doctorate in history and literature of religions from Northwestern University and a diploma in analytical psychology at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich. So welcome, Melanie.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Melanie, soon I want to ask you whether Carl Jung was a mystic and all of that, but usually, if it's okay by you, like to start with someone's story and the turning points maybe and how you got to Zurich and a little bit about your early life, if we could start there.
All right. A little bit of the road less traveled, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we were talking before we started just now, I think my early life sort of set the ground for me to become an analyst. I was raised in a Roman Catholic family, Irish Catholic family. But it wasn't exactly as ordinary as it might have appeared from the outside. My mother was very devoted to the saints and so forth, but there are these other currents, as I was telling you, in the family, around the underworld, around the ghostly. My father had been a hobo during the Depression. He left home at 16. They were too poor to support all the children. He left home and he rode the rails and looked for work, as he traveled from place to place. So when we were growing up, we had some wonderful stories and very spooky stories about those days. He was a real misanthrope because he'd seen a lot of the dark side of human nature. So I sort of grew up with this strange spirituality where I was always trying to fight my father's darker picture of the world through looking to the light, so to speak. But we had all of these stories of the ghostly realm. I had been a replacement child, and if you know Christina Shalensky's work, a replacement child, Jung was one, Freud was one. Children who are connected in some way, sometimes named after a deceased sibling, or followed a deceased sibling. And this sets up a kind of interesting sort of psychology sometimes. And so I was very connected to the underworld through my father's stories of ghosts and sleeping in graveyards and so forth, but also through my parents' first child, who died of a heart condition that I also had when I was little. So the underworld, life and death were very close together. And my father had also been a kind of medial psychic when he was a child. He'd been born with a veil over his face, which by folklore, that meant that you would have psychic abilities, that you could talk to the dead and so forth. So he actually did. There were a lot of stories about people witnessing him speaking to a deceased sister and to seeing ghosts and all of these stories. So there was a kind of strange mixture of paranormal things, as well as a kind of Catholic tradition that was focused on the saints and the world of miracles and the Mass and so forth. So from my father, I got a real sort of suspicion of institutions, because of this background. He was a self-taught aeronautics engineer. So, I mean, we were a middle-class family, but he had a real suspicion of institutions. And so I sort of inherited that. And that, of course, led me eventually toward mysticism, right? Because I wanted to experience something.
Well, they
But a
might be the supreme renegade, the mystic. We might be jumping ahead a little bit, but they kind of like they want to bypass all authority levels or something and go to the source maybe or something.
yeah. Well, I mean, some, but most, at least most that we know of, like in the Western Christian lineage,
Yeah,
particularly the Middle Ages, um, the mystics often were very careful to associate, particularly women mystics, to associate with mentors who were, very much orthodox within the tradition, were priests, were
right,
confessors, and to, um, talk about their visions and their experiences to be sure that they didn't cross that line, you
right.
know.
Okay.
And not that everybody was successful with that, which we can talk about in more detail if you want. So I
Well,
think the first thing for the wit mystic is just to be in the presence of God and to pray and to find ways to grow closer to God or the absolute, the divinity, however. That's really the first order, I'd say.
okay. Well, let's go back to your story for a second. But just before we do, what though would be the difference between a mystic and say just a person with religious sentiments? You know, we know someone who's religious or whatever, and there does seem to be some kind of something which is a little different than
Yes,
a straight religious person.
right, right. Well, I mean, I think most of us have had mystical experiences, right? With a sense of, the sacred that somehow becomes very powerful, or numinous experiences, right?
Right.
Um, um, Powerful dream experiences, heart opening in prayer,
Mm.
a spontaneous sense of the interconnectedness of all things. I mean, these are pretty common experiences. So,
Although people might not tell them to everyone, but
no,
they have
no.
had them.
I would say, I mean, certainly you have had them. That would be my guess.
Yes, for
Yes,
sure.
just inspiration, the practice, spiritual practice is meant to cultivate a sense of closeness, to the sacred, to God, to the divine.
Mm.
Um, and so that that evokes certain states of mind and certain states of consciousness. So I would differentiate that, the mystical experience,
Yeah,
which is very human and common, from from the mystic. I mean, the mystic in religious studies, we would say the mystic is a person who is um, experiencing and cultivating a sense of the presence of God. And I would say more formally, the mystic, I would think of the mystic as someone who is cultivating the presence of God, um, who's pursuing regular experiences of that, and is devoted to a practice
right,
for the sake of cultivating a sense of the divine presence, you
right.
know, and and a
Mm,
lineage often, that they come from a lineage of practices, contemplative practices or other practices
mm,
that gives them direction, you know. So
mm,
I mean, like the mystics, medieval mystics, they just thought of themselves as Christians,
mm.
but they were very focused on their Christianity and on the devotional aspect of the tradition.
And would one have to have had like mystical visions, perhaps, or not? You know,
Not,
because no, not
um,
necessary.
not necessarily.
Mm,
Um, so, I mean, we can look at visionary life in terms of Jungian psychology and how it's tied in, maybe, if you're interested in that.
mm,
Because in a mystical vision, there is it is part of probably a larger process where, say, in terms of the medieval
Mm,
formulation, one would practice meditation, which involves images.
mm,
Okay, so that has to do with the use of images and symbols as a way to get closer to the divine. And so we see in Jungian psychology the power of images and the the
and
important valence of symbols.
an active imagination, perhaps, as a practice of
Abs-
enabling that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I think one thing that Jung says, I think this is in the essay on the nature of the psyche, when he talks about the soul
Mm,
as the place where images are made.
yeah.
And so the way that I envisage that would be that the personal, conscious and unconscious is sitting on a borderland with the image making function of the soul.
Right.
So there are deeper archetypal currents that meet our cultural, personal consciousness and our
Right.
unconscious, whatever's
Yeah.
in the personal unconscious. And from that, images are formed,
Right.
right?
Okay.
So in the medieval context, that would be meditation. And you see, for example, in nunneries,
Mm,
in convents, there would be little wooden infant Jesuses that nuns would use for prayer to help them imagine that they were nurturing the infant Jesus. So that would be also a form of meditation. Where
right.
the deep mysticism comes in is when that form of meditation slips into contemplation.
Right.
And this is where Neoplatonism might come in as a way to sort of explain what's happening there.
Melanie, can I just, sorry, I'm butting in a little here, but I'm just a little aware we didn't finish your story. So, but I'd love to
Ah,
come back to this,
okay,
in the sense of this is
sure.
an interesting topic. But can we just say from this Irish Catholic upbringing, just to recap a little, and with some of the spooky stuff that your father
Yeah.
and your mother's Catholicism, how how did you go to study religion? How did you get to that point in the first place? And
Yeah.
then how did you get to Zurich?
Right.
Let's do that.
So, yeah, you know, over the years, of course, I'm in high school in the 60s and
Right.
early 70s.
Yeah.
And and you know what the atmosphere was like,
Mm.
in those days. So there's a counterculture, there's love and peace and all of that. And there's an opening to the East.
Yeah.
People are starting to become interested in Eastern meditation practices and yoga and
Alan
Islamic
Watts,
poet. Carl,
Alan,
yes,
becoming big. And,
absolutely. Yes, all of those, and also Islamic poetry, mystical poetry.
yeah.
So, so I was sort of dabbling in these things. I
Yeah.
was, I was young, but I was influenced,
Mm.
Bob Dylan in the background and the folk stuff. And my father was like a Woody Guthrie in my mind. So, I'm influenced by all of these poetic currents.
Mm.
And starting to read mystical literature or read Vedantic literature. And
Mm.
eventually I started to practice Vedantic yoga practice,
Mm.
the philosophical side, the meditation side.
Mm.
And so I was becoming very interested in that and absorbed in that for quite a few years.
Mm.
I went to India for a year, mostly just to
For,
experience the culture.
for a whole
Um,
year?
for a whole year, yes, I was a traveler, as they say. You know,
Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Because I sometimes think of the shock of arriving in India and then how it kind of slowly, what's the word, strips you down into the beauty of what it has to offer. you know, and
Yeah,
how deep it kind of goes in. But it's definitely a shock in its own
it
way. There's no
is.
two ways
It
about
definitely, it was. That is exactly how I would describe it. I mean,
it.
just getting off the plane in Bombay, I remember this sense, this synthesis of jasmine and the heat and the humidity and the smell of urine and
Mm.
you know everything human. And it was an extraordinary time. I'm sure India is a bit different these days,
Yes.
but you know, it was just mind-blowing
Mm.
to be walking through the streets and the beggars and the different, manifestations of humanity in India.
Mm.
So I traveled and I used photography as a way to sort of organize myself.
Right.
And I would just meet other travelers and they would say, you should go to this place or that place. And so I had some extraordinary experiences there, also of the mystical sort.
Mm.
There are too many stories to tell,
Yeah.
but
Mm.
I for a while traveled on a train with a tantric yogi with a group of Australians, and
Well, that's why you had mystical experiences because you were with the.
the Australians, exactly. They were so much fun. They were so much fun. Um, and I would have these wonderful experiences sometimes of just coming across a holy person,
Mm.
which I remember once I was hiking in a rainforest
Mm.
in Tamil Nadu down in the south,
Mm.
and I just came across a village priest guru,
Mm.
and somehow just being in proximity to this person, I sort of, I mean, this is how I would describe it now. I just sort of had an experience of the world soul in the sense that our minds were conjoined,
Yeah.
everything was interconnected. I mean, it was a mystical experience, and we were speaking to each other out of this shared mind soul space. And it was as if he knew everything about me and I him. It was an
You know,
extraordinary thing.
they have that word darshan in India, and I came across the word drishti, and I remember once someone saying, if you want to learn meditation, sit. You know, when I was at a place, sit with this old man who he must have been 75, 80, and just look into his eyes. And it's what you're talking about. It's kind of like that through that darshan drishti or something that one goes into. We could call it the world soul now in Jung language, or is transported.
Yeah, yeah,
You know.
yeah. I mean, the Christian mystics had a way of talking about that, where one could come into the experience where you see yourself through God's eyes. And I think in India, the culture opens itself
Mm.
to I mean, it's in the greeting, namaste. It's sort of like, I see the divine in you, you see the divine in me, you
Mm.
know. And so it's that kind of experience
Which is a
that
great opening, really.
it's
But
it's
but
a
the thing is to do what to do with it after. Like after your year, how were you when you kind of went back to? Did you go back to Washington?
um well, I was at the time living in Southern Maryland,
Right.
and near the college place where I went to college and where I grew up.
Mm.
Yeah, I went to work after that
Mm.
for just a year, but where it left me was, and I continued to practice Vedanta,
Mm.
um, but I then became interested in my own Catholic background again. Not so much as an observant person, but I wanted to know, well, where is the deep, deep religious experience in this Western Catholic tradition?
Mm.
And so when I was studying history, so I decided, because I just wanted to know. I mean, I was always a seeker. I
Mm.
wasn't a career seeker. I was a an experience seeker. I was a
Yeah.
knowledge seeker. So
Yeah.
I applied and I was accepted to Northwestern University to study with the specialist there on 14th century mysticism. He was the person in the States who was a scholar focusing on 14th century Western mysticism. So that's how I studied mysticism more formally, is through that experience.
And then I kind of take it that you became a lecturer in that. Is that right? Or you became uh, a professor of
Yes, a professor. Well, I was a medievalist and I
yeah,
taught for a while in a liberal arts college in the
right,
history department
right.
there, so medieval history and women's history because of my research in women's Christianity and women's mystical um, Christianity. Um, but before that, while I was in graduate school, that's where I came across Jung.
Oh, so well before was it? But what it was like a seed that was kind of growing, or can
It
we talk
was,
like
it
that?
was a seed growing, yes, that grew. It was a seed that grew slowly,
Mm,
slowly. I was studying visionary literature,
yeah,
right? That was my research subject. And I was with colleagues one day and I said, I had this extraordinary dream, right? With Jung, it often starts with dreaming.
yeah,
And I had dreamed of this great turtle with a tree growing out of its back,
mm,
and of course it was an awesome experience of the dream and there was nothing personal in it. And I just mentioned it to one of my colleagues. And he said, "Oh, that's an archetypal dream. Don't you know about Jung and archetypes?" So then I went and I looked up and I found that motif in the Lenape American Indian tribe. Is it called the world tree or the um, something tree? And then I
mm,
found that there was a version of that in Indonesian mythology. And so that was my first exposure to the idea of the archetype. And that gave me a sense of what's happening, maybe psychologically, you could say, behind the visionary experience.
mm.
So
So,
that ultimately led me to the Jungian training.
you started to take it seriously, and you found your way to Zurich. And what happened in Zurich?
Um, what happened in Zurich? Well,
Just a small question.
I came, I conquered, I know. It was a wonderful experience.
Mm,
I always think of that time in Zurich as kind of a smorgasbord,
mm,
where the faculty, different people had their area of focus. And it wasn't like an American university experience at all. I mean,
mm,
of course, because we're focused on our dreams, we're doing personal processes alongside the study. Um, but also because, as the European system is generally, you could pretty much choose who you wanted to study with, what you wanted to focus on. We hired different analysts to teach us different aspects of Jungian psychology, in addition to going to the lectures and so forth. And so it was a wonderful immersion in psyche
mm.
and, going to analysis almost every day, waking up with like 5 dreams, remembering like 5 dreams. It was a beautiful experience. It will always be the highlight of my
Mm.
life.
And was there someone there? I know we're not meant to say this, Melanie, but was there someone that, in terms of influences, who did you resonate with a
Yeah,
lot there in terms of teachers, let's say?
yeah. Um, John Hill. I did a lot of work with John Hill.
Yeah,
Um, and who, of course, is an Irish Christian, probably would qualify as a mystic,
right.
and just had a lovely way of talking about psyche.
Mm,
I was very inspired by John and did a lot of supervisory work with Tony Fry, who is gone now, unfortunately, but he was He was an older analyst. He had analyzed with C.A. Meyer. So there was a lot of the old institute in him. And he was a beautiful soul. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from him. Yeah.
Okay. And coming back, like, okay, so let's maybe come back to mysticism now. When you did what was it, the 14th century women mystics, what kind of things were you, or what did you find from that exploration? What would you say?
Yeah. Well, one thing, I guess because of my, unconsciously, because of my uh, own inherited distrust of authority, I was interested in um, the mystical experience and the relationship of the mystical experience to authority,
Right.
in the sense of how did the mystics interact with authority? What was the environment like there? And what was their relationship to the outer society? I was interested in that too.
Mm,
So my research at the time focused on Catherine of Siena, my
mm,
dissertation at least, because I was interested in her because one, she was a lay Christian and mystic. She wasn't in a convent.
mm,
Um, and because she did something that was actually against church law, which was to teach publicly, to teach spirituality theology publicly. And so she was a good example of a mystic, and she had extraordinary mystical experiences of union with Christ. She was very much in the Augustinian tradition, devotional mysticism, where you sort of, you come closer to the divine through devotional imaginings and love. And so, and also, annihilation of the ego. So,
mm,
she was really in that, very harsh, rigid, sort of antibody kind of tradition that you do find in the Middle Ages.
mm,
Antibody might be too strong, but the body, like the ego, is to be defeated,
mm,
its desires and so forth. So she was an extraordinary mystic and very much admired in her time. This is the late 14th century. And how she and other women mystics before her were able to sometimes be more public figures and more influential figures to write. She wrote in her vernacular, um, or to teach. In her case, she taught publicly, which was very unusual. Would be to say to draw on biblical prophetic themes, to align themselves with the archetypal patterns of the Old Testament prophets, so that they become the judges, you
mm,
know, they're the ones who are, you know, uh, talking with priests and the church about, aligning themselves with the true Christian way.
mm,
Um, and um, and one of the motifs, a friend and teacher of mine, Barbara Newman, spoke about this very eloquently in her studies of Hildegard of Bingen. Um, this motif that the divine presence is made manifest in weakness. It's from Paul, the epistles of
yeah.
Paul. The divine power is made manifest in weakness. Women mystics often use that kind of motif as a way to say, my authority comes directly from God. Because I'm a woman and you say I'm weak and I'm very, liable to sin and so forth. That doesn't work against me. That actually works for me. My weakness becomes a doorway for the
Right.
divine to enter, right? So
Yeah.
my experience has its own authority. But of course, they were very careful to not to say things that were unorthodox. There's that.
Well, what's the danger in a way with a mystic? Is it that they go off on their own? I mean, I know I'm putting it in a simplistic way, but I guess any orthodoxy doesn't want people coming up too much with their own stuff, really, does it?
Well, there are a couple of things that were, I think, of most concern.
Mm.
Um, One is that the when the mystic has an experience of the divine that goes into these deep, deep reaches of the divine darkness, what we would call the apophatic
Right.
um, aspect of the divine, which is that term is linked to Neoplatonism. That is that the divine, the ultimate divine, the Godhead, is in complete darkness to us. There is there is no comprehension and there are no words to describe it. But when the mystical experience gets very close to that place, there's often an experience of union that one will come out of the experience and they'll say, I was basically completely united with the divine. I was united with God. Um, and and then the language circles around, God is in the soul. And the danger is that one could slip into saying, I am God,
Right.
like God is me and I am God. And so this kind of language, one had to be very careful to, at the same time, speak of union while having some bit of differentiation.
Yeah.
So, for example, um, there's a mystic, a French mystic, Marguerite Porete, who was burned at the stake
Mm.
because her language, she wrote this book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. So, of course, other people could read this. So, there's a
Mm.
fear that simple people, as they said, simple people could be, led into error
That's
with,
right.
with but that her language was too close to full identification with God.
Right.
So,
Hence the necessary caution in navigating the politics, we could almost say, of uh, how to remain kosher
well,
uh,
yes, you could put
within
it that
your
way.
tradition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. How to, how to know enough about theology to
Mm.
know what the images are that are within the doctrine, you
Mm.
know. And
Mm.
theology is, it's very sophisticated stuff. So this is why most mystics, particularly the women, would associate with confessors to help them navigate the language, you
Right.
know. Um, so so yeah, there are definitely some fatalities there.
Mm.
The other thing that the church was concerned about was something called antinomianism. And this is the idea that if one had a deep personal experience of the divine, one might think that, that you had achieved the highest, and so you were no longer subject to the laws, to
Right.
church law, to the commandments, uh, to the bounds of Christian theology and practice.
If
So,
we just jump ahead to Carl Jung for a moment, though,
mhm,
um, was he a mystic? Let's start with that.
yeah. So,
In
this is
terms of in terms of all of that you were just talking about and
that I was
his
talking about. Yeah.
lived experience.
Well, I don't think we know enough about Jung's personal practices. The Red
Mm.
Book reveals a lot,
Mm.
but it just in terms of my formal definition of
Mm.
mysticism,
Mm.
um, we don't know outside of active imagination and working with the symbols and the way in which he sort of incorporated the whole esoteric tradition. We don't know what he actually practiced. Now, of course, Peter Kingsley is making a very strong case that that he was in a lineage, in a mystical lineage,
Mm.
going back to the Orphic tradition. So I think Kingsley makes a pretty good case for it, but based on the Red Book, based on interviews with people who knew Jung, but we don't know. I mean, I don't think we have that much evidence, given
mm,
what he revealed and didn't reveal, to say
mm,
that, he was clearly practicing,
mm,
within
mm,
the lineage on a daily basis. I'm not qualified to say it, but I think Peter Kingsley makes a strong argument
mm.
um, for that.
It's I mean, there's the formal definitions, isn't there? But I was thinking this morning, there's probably a lot of people around that in a general wider sense, if you asked them if they were a mystic, they would probably say, no, you know, no, I've never thought of myself that way. But if you ask them, do you believe in a mystery far greater than yourself? It's kind of like, it's widespread, isn't it? People love Rumi, people go out
Yeah,
into nature and have the mysterium tremendum or whatever. And
sure.
there's a lot of people that believe in the mystery, which is kind of, I mean, I suppose there's so many factors here. The first thing was in Jung's time, seemed to be a shock. In Victorian era, it was a shocking thing to be called a mystic. Um, it meant you were maybe non-scientific, or it
Right.
wasn't something that you wanted to be hung on you or whatever.
Yeah.
But to see it, if I, in my lived experience, if I see it in terms of the mystery, then I would say, well, I'm very, um, what's the word, devoted to that mystery that is larger than oneself.
Yes. Yes. And so, you could say, I'm attuned to the mystical,
Mm,
right? I
yeah.
mean,
Mm,
and I mean that's it. That's the essence of it.
mm,
That if we're going to talk about the importance of, let's bringing back the soul, so to speak,
yeah.
in our times, um, having a sensibility, having some way to consciously tune into the soul,
Mm,
to cultivate what's soulful,
mm,
is a way of staying connected to the mystery.
mm,
So I think where people, can get lost these days is we might try a little bit of this because there's so much about, there's so much around, so many practices and so forth. But it's hard to stay true to a path so that you can deepen
mm,
that going into the mystery through a path. And that's kind of, I think, what we've lost where we've lost tradition,
mm,
religious tradition
mm,
that is still vibrant, and
yeah.
still soulful.
Mm,
And it does still exist in places, but a lot of people have lost interest because so much has been watered down.
mm,
So much has gone into literal and
mm,
fundamentalist direction, which you know, is not cultivating an openness to the symbolic in the experiential realm, with important exceptions. I mean, one might say Pentecostal Christianity is mystical because people go into these states,
mm,
they allow themselves to go into these states and they experience the Holy Ghost. So, you know,
mm.
there's that. But I think a lot of people these days, um, they say they're spiritual but not religious, and um, maybe a little bit floundering uh, in
The
terms of,
supermarket that's maybe sometimes been called, um, the supermarket of different ideas and tastes. But it seems to me it's like this idea of getting the feet on the ground too, is sometimes getting connected to deeper traditions. But out on the street, religion is almost seen as over there on the far right, maybe sometimes these days. And these kind of, what is it, mystery traditions, living mystery traditions, are maybe not widely understood.
Well, yes. Yeah, you mean, I think one does have to do some digging,
Mm,
right? Um, and so we do have this in the States, there's this very concerning movement toward Christian nationalism, and that's
mm,
more coming out of the kind of evangelical and fundamentalist
mm,
communities that have cultivated and have been cultivated by politicians on the right. On
mm,
the other hand, we still do have a strong social justice uh, m- uh, activity in communities, particularly coming out of liberal Methodism, some Episcopal churches, and some Catholic communities too. So
right.
there's still some vibrant um, churches out
Mm,
there. Um,
mm,
but the deeply mystical, um, I think one has to, sort of dig around for it a bit.
mm, mm.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
and what about, when we were speaking just before we started, Neoplatonism, that I remember, speaking to Thomas More and the influence of Ficino on him. But what I've always found interesting is that they drew on, well, Ficino was a Catholic priest, but he's also interested in Hermes or the Hermetic traditions. He's also into the old Platonic traditions or
Yes,
translating them.
yes,
How did they do? What's that all about? I mean, it's such a interesting and flourishing
yeah.
period of time, it seems.
I mean, it's a fascinating. Ficino is fascinating.
Mm,
And it was, well, it's sort of like Ficino was almost responsible for starting the Renaissance, you know. And he didn't become a priest until like 1473.
right.
Before that, I mean, he was recognized by the powerful Medici, you know,
Mm,
um, patriarch Cosima as brilliant when he was
mm,
quite young.
mm,
And eventually, Cosimo wanted Ficino to translate, do some translations. Ficino had done some translations of the Hermetica,
mm, mm,
so the ancient Egyptian astrology, mystical sciences, magic. So Ficino had done that before becoming a priest. Then he started to translate Plato because Cosimo Medici sent to have, there was so much in the Greek that was lost to the West.
mm. Yeah.
And Cosimo had people dig up from libraries manuscripts of the Greek,
Mm,
Platonic Greek texts. And Ficino, who had studied Greek, translated them into Latin. So we owe a huge debt to him for bringing
mm,
Plato and then later the Neoplatonists back to the West.
mm,
Um, but he he had been particularly interested in the Orphic hymns, which he translated as well, and he would sing them. He would sing the Orphic hymns as a way of kind of calling down correspondences from the realm of the gods, which he may have seen more as principles rather than concrete, pagan gods,
mm.
but enlivening the self, enlivening the soul, enlivening the universe. And so this was like the big thing that Ficino did,
Mm,
um, but also drew more and more attention to him. And then Cosimo de' Medici gave him or through him opened the Platonic Academy,
yeah.
Plato's Academy again. So all these intellectuals started doing these translations, right?
Mm,
And it may be that because they were walking a fine line with the church,
mm,
you know, um, that becoming a priest might have been a little bit of a shield.
yeah.
That has been argued.
It seems a little deft. how they got, got away with it. I mean, there's a few
Well,
pagan beliefs thrown there and
yeah.
a little bit of astrology as well, by the way.
Right, but astrology hadn't been a problem. Even the patristic fathers, I mean, astrology was circulated among Christians
Right.
going way back. Um, and some magic too.
Mm,
Augustine in the fifth century objected to astrology because he thought it contradicted the doctrine of the free will, right?
right.
But it was all of that was of interest to priests,
Right.
even magic of interest to priests and bishops. I mean, this academy, there were bishops there. There was a to become a pope there, a guy who would become a pope
Mm,
um, in the academy. So this interest in the ancients had been there before,
mm,
particularly Aristotle, Lucretius. But of course, Ficino brought it in with a vengeance, right?
mm,
So the more people started to engage, scholars started to engage with this, the more dangerous it became. Not just because it's magic and astrology and alchemy or whatever, but because when it starts getting out to the public, that's when the church becomes concerned. And we see this too in the century before with Meister Eckhart, his
right.
brilliant Neoplatonic sermons, which
Mm,
were full of paradox,
mm,
were brilliant and tolerated until word got out that he was preaching in the vernacular. So
mm,
when you start publishing in the vernacular, or as did what Poliziano made a play of Orpheus and Eurydice based on Ficino's translations.
right.
And that that got noticed because it was written in the vernacular. So everybody could understand
Mm.
now, this pagan
So it's
story.
kind of swaying the masses a little with powerful stuff, if we want to put
There's
it
a
that way,
danger of
powerful
it.
myth.
That's right. That's right. So, Ficino also had written a book on the Christian religion where he tried to, I think, synthesize a little bit, the Orphic hymns and some of these, astrology and some of these pagan beliefs with Christianity. I think he was trying to harmonize them with the teachings of the church. Um, but as time went on, there are other events in Florence that led to a very, very bad ending
Mm,
for the Florentine Renaissance,
mm.
which I guess we don't have time to go into
Yeah,
in detail, but that gives you a sense of it.
yeah. Just one last thing on that is the Orphic. Um, it was kind of prior to, we might think about the Greek mysteries and all of that, but the Orphic was before that even, wasn't it? It's kind of
Yes.
like it's a different. Like that takes a little bit of digging out to understand a little bit more about that, but it seems, what's the word? Like even if we talk about the Greek pantheon, uh, and everyone's talking about Dionysus or Hermes or whatever, but not so many people are talking about Orpheus. But it seems to me that as a mystery, there's something so wonderful about it. That whole thing of attunement, the music, the resonance, the
Yes.
when you're talking about ecology, it's like it's the ultimate ecology in a way, isn't it? Orphism.
Yeah. 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 I mean, the little I know about it, I mean, it just
Mm,
sounds so beautiful. And if
mm,
you um, read some of the hymns, the
mm,
translations of the
mm,
hymns, they're so beautiful. They're just sort of cosmological, calling on the cosmos, you know,
mm,
to to embrace one,
mm,
um, to lift one,
mm,
the idea that you can call down gods.
mm,
By through music and through
mm,
poetry.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean,
There's
what's
something
not
there.
to like, right?
And there seems to be this reawakening interest in the Eleusinian mysteries. There is a somewhat of a or the what some people call it maybe is the what is it the esoteric Western tradition or
Yes,
whatever.
yes, right.
But jumping forward, because maybe we are getting close to the time. But jumping forward to your time as a Jungian, what would you say about all this and religion and mysticism in general within the people you see, within what happens in your
Right,
practice? What
right.
how does it relate, work?
Yeah. Well, it's an incredible honor to be
Mm,
working with people
mm,
um, around so many things, and certainly with their dreams and their spiritual experiences, and fitting this into a whole life path to see, to witness someone as they reflect and they start to see their story, as an evolution, into soul making, right? Or where what was once painful and perhaps traumatic can sometimes be transmuted into, a greater understanding, of the life path and the mystery of the life,
mm,
so that's been really been an incredible privilege to do that work with people, you
mm.
know. Um,
Do you find, I mean, I know this might sound like a silly question, but do you find that people do become a little bit more aware of their religious side or their mystic side as they come? Is that what you were just saying, in a way?
Well, I think sometimes people become more aware. I mean, this is the dream work, when you really start to pay attention
Mm,
and you start to see there is some higher intelligence inside of me that
mm,
is constantly in conversation with me, responding to what's on my mind, giving me a possible doorway into seeing things differently or looking in this direction or that direction. So, I would say that's like a dialectic with the soul, right? With that dream making part of oneself. And it becomes numinous if one sticks with it, right? In the sense that there are these amazing um, messages coming through, and that one is not alone. That the dream is in response to one's deeper thought and what's going on in one's heart and hopes and fears, that something is responding internally. So you don't have to be a believer, but
mm.
there's a mystery right there.
A mystery and a divine intelligence, perhaps, which which is kind of the two-way conversation between the person, the dream,
Absolutely.
the world.
I would I would certainly call it divine. But
Mm.
whatever somebody wants to call it,
But they can call it
call
what
it.
they want. And just lastly, Melanie, this time, I've been asking everyone this question. This weird, wonderful, intense, upside down time that we're living in. What have you found about this time? How can we attend to our soul in this present time?
Yeah, it's a difficult time. It's a scary time.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, I would go with that book written so long ago by Thomas More, Care of the Soul, Cultivating the Sacred in the Everyday.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, the other thing that I've brought to my practice during the pandemic and then during this horrible election in the States, which has just been so devastating for many people, um, that um, if we lean into it, and this is what I'm trying to do, leaning into it rather than trying to push it away, with a sense of the presence of the ancestors who have gone through these things generation after generation, to feel, speaking for myself, to feel that I'm not alone, you know, that there are others sitting by the fire with me, hoping, waiting, you know, for some light to come through, doing what we can outwardly, of course, but knowing that we're not alone
That's
and
good.
tending to the hearth, I would say. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a nice place to leave it. But that's a beautiful idea of that what is it, that community of ancestors who are also with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's lovely.
I think Jung showed us that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, thank you very much for speaking
My
today.
pleasure.
And I
It's my
hope you have
pleasure.
a lovely evening over there.
Yes, and happy holidays, and see you on the other side.